1944. The world was burning in the final years of the Second World War. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins, families torn apart, and soldiers on every side had surrendered dreams to the chaos of battle. But far away from the thunder of artillery and the choking smoke of bombed-out streets, another reality was unfolding. It was a world that seemed almost impossible to believe, a world inside the barbed wire fences of American prisoner-of-war camps. Among the prisoners were German women, nurses, auxiliaries and support staff who had followed their armies across borders, only to find themselves captured. They braced for the worst. They expected humiliation, hunger and despair. They expected to be treated as enemies, stripped of dignity, and left to starve as punishment for their loyalty to the Reich. And yet, what awaited them was something that felt almost unreal. One morning, as dawn spread its first light across the camp, they smelled it, the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked bread. Real bread. Warm, soft, golden loaves pulled from ovens, their crusts still cracking in the cool air. And beside it, small porcelain dishes filled with butter, smooth and rich, unlike anything many of them had tasted in years. For women who had lived through years of rationing, stale substitutes and bitter hunger, this moment felt like stepping into a dream. It was not victory, nor freedom, nor home, but it was kindness. And it was nourishment given by the very hands they thought would deny them everything. This is the story of German women, prisoners of war who could not believe the simple miracle of fresh bread and butter. A story where humanity triumphed in the unlikeliest of places. The camp was quiet in the early hours, wrapped in the hush of dawn. Thin fog clung to the wire fences, softening the outlines of watchtowers that loomed above the sleeping prisoners. German women stirred on their bunks, wrapped in blankets that never seemed warm enough, their thoughts restless with questions of what captivity would bring. For many of them, the nights had been filled with fear, their imaginations haunted by visions of cruelty. They had heard tales, whispered by soldiers before their capture, that American camps would break them, strip them of dignity, and grind them down to nothing. They expected hunger to be their first and most merciless enemy, but that morning, something unexpected happened. The air was different, tinged with a scent so rare, so long forgotten, that for a moment it felt like a trick of memory. The women raised their heads, frowning, their senses straining. The aroma was faint at first, drifting across the compound like a ghost, yet unmistakable. Bread. Real bread. Not the bitter, coarse, sawdust-filled loaves they had eaten in Germany during the last years of war, but something warmer, richer, more alive. The smell grew stronger with every passing moment, until there was no denying it. It was the smell of freshly baked bread, straight from an oven. The reaction was almost physical. Some women sat upright, staring at one another in disbelief. Others whispered, afraid to name what they sensed, as though speaking it aloud might shatter the fragile hope. Hunger had trained their bodies to respond to the scent of food with an intensity that bordered on pain. Their mouths watered, their stomachs clenched, but more than that, it awakened memories long buried. Childhood mornings before the war, when mothers had placed warm bread on wooden tables. Market stalls filled with golden loaves before rationing emptied them. The feeling of breaking a crust still hot, the steam rising in the cold air of a German winter. When the guards finally unlocked the doors and led the women toward the mess hall, the mystery became reality. They saw soldiers carrying baskets, actual baskets, woven and heavy, with loaves stacked inside. The bread gleamed softly in the morning light, each crust golden brown, the smell so strong it seemed to wrap around them. It was more than food, it was a vision, something that belonged to a different world than the one they had left behind. For years, their bread had been dark and heavy, stretched with barley, potatoes, even sawdust to make it last. It had been rationed so severely that sometimes families survived on a single stale slice for the day. In bombed-out cities, women had stood in endless lines, clutching ration cards, only to return home with bread so bitter that even children struggled to swallow it. And now here, in the very place they expected suffering, the air was filled with the promise of abundance. The loaves were soft, smooth, and fragrant. They were the kind of bread that many of these women had not seen since before the war, a bread that no longer seemed possible in their homeland. When they entered the mess hall, the sight struck them silent. The tables were plain, but on each one sat baskets of bread, waiting. The room glowed with sunlight, pouring through high windows, dust motes dancing in the air, and in that light, the bread seemed almost holy. The women hesitated, uncertain if this was truly for them. Prisoners did not expect generosity. They expected rations, the kind of gruel and scraps that broke both body and spirit. Yet the guards nodded, ushering them forward. Some women stepped slowly, their hands trembling as they reached for the first loaf. The crust was warm under their fingers, still crisp from the oven. They broke it open, and the steam rose, carrying the smell of wheat so pure it made their eyes sting with tears. The first bites were silent. For a moment, the mess hall held only the sound of crusts breaking, of bread tearing apart, of women chewing slowly, reverently, as though afraid to wake from a dream. No one spoke. The bread melted on their tongues, soft and sweet in a way they had forgotten. They ate not with greed, but with awe, every mouthful a reminder that life could still hold small miracles. It was impossible not to think of home. Some women remembered their mothers baking in wood-fired ovens, the smell filling their childhood kitchens. Others thought of bakeries that had once stood in their villages, long since reduced to rubble. For a brief moment, they were not prisoners in a foreign land, they were daughters again. Wives, sisters, seated at a table that felt familiar, safe and warm, and with every bite something deeper shifted inside them. The bread was nourishment, yes, but it was also proof. Proof that captivity would not be the starvation they had feared. Proof that the Americans, whatever else could be said of them, were not here to strip them of their humanity. The bread was not just bread, it was a message. Silent but unmistakable, women who had entered the camp with eyes full of suspicion and dread now looked at one another with something new, relief, maybe even gratitude. They held the bread close, as if to anchor themselves to the reality that this was happening. Some laughed softly through tears. Others simply kept eating, unable to stop, each mouthful undoing years of hunger and despair. The guards said little, watching from the edges, but perhaps they knew what this simple gesture meant. It was not a feast, not by any grand measure of luxury. But for women who had braced for cruelty, the sight of fresh loaves carried into the hall was a revelation. It was kindness delivered in the simplest form possible, yet it struck harder than any words could. In the quiet of that morning, with the sun rising higher, the German women prisoners began to understand that their captivity would not be the nightmare they had imagined. There would be struggles ahead, yes, but there would also be moments like this, moments where humanity broke through the barbed wire, and as they finished their bread, holding the last crumbs in their hands as though reluctant to let them go, they knew this was a memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. For years afterward, many would remember the first time they tasted that bread, the shock of its warmth, the disbelief that such a gift could exist in a place built for enemies. It was, in the end, not just bread, but hope. The mess hall had already quieted after the miracle of bread, but the story of that morning did not end there. The women had only begun to absorb the shock of holding loaves, so white and fragrant that it felt as though they had stepped into a world untouched by war. And then came the second surprise, one that cut even deeper into their hearts and memories. At first they didn't notice it, because they were too occupied with tearing apart crusts and swallowing with trembling lips. But then, along the tables, bowls and dishes began to appear, set down by the guards with the same casual precision as before. It was not soup. It was not thin broth or watery stew. It was something golden, rich and shining faintly in the morning light. Butter. The word itself seemed like a memory more than a reality. Butter had been gone from Germany for years, vanishing from shop shelves almost as quickly as the war began. For many of these women, butter had been rationed away before they reached their 20s. What little remained had been reserved for children, for officers, or for the rarest of occasions. Most families scraped by with margarine, thin, bland, sometimes even rancid, or with animal fat if they were lucky. And as the war dragged on, even those substitutions disappeared. Bread was eaten dry, brittle, stripped of comfort. Butter had become a story, a relic of the past, a taste that lived only in memory. So when the women saw it, thick, creamy, yellow against white porcelain, they stared as though it were a mirage. Some leaned forward, afraid to blink. Others whispered to one another in disbelief, their voices barely carrying above the silence. Could it really be? Were the Americans so careless, so confident in their supplies, that they would serve butter to their prisoners? No one moved at first. The bread had already broken their expectations, but this was beyond imagining. To have both bread and butter together was to step into a kind of luxury they had not even dared to dream about. Finally, one woman reached forward. Her hands shook as she picked up a knife, its edge dull from use but gleaming in the sunlight. She pressed it into the butter, and the soft golden cream yielded instantly, curling against the blade. Her breath caught. She spread it across a slice of bread, the warmth of the loaf melting the butter into pale rivulets. The sight alone was enough to make her eyes sting. She lifted it to her lips, and when she tasted it, real, rich butter for the first time in years, she closed her eyes. The world around her blurred, and for a brief, impossible moment, she was no longer a prisoner of war. She was a child again, sitting at a kitchen table while her mother sliced bread and set down butter with a smile. Others followed, cautiously at first, then with growing urgency. The knives scraped softly against porcelain, the butter spreading over bread with a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial. The room filled with sighs, gasps, and whispers of disbelief. Some women laughed, short, breathless bursts that were half joy and half sorrow. Others wept silently, covering their faces with one hand while holding bread in the other. To eat butter was to remember all they had lost, and yet also to believe, if only for a moment, that not everything was gone forever. For years they had been told that the enemy was cruel, inhuman, merciless. Butter was the furthest thing from their minds when they marched into captivity. And yet here it was, offered freely, without demand, without condition. They had braced themselves for hunger, for degradation, for punishment. Instead, they were given nourishment that felt indulgent. It was not simply about food. It was about dignity. It was about being treated not as animals, not even as defeated foes, but as human beings with the same needs, the same desires, the same capacity for joy. The guards did not speak much as they watched. They carried themselves with the indifference of routine, but perhaps in some small way they understood what this meant. They had grown up with butter, had never known life without it. For them, it was just another part of breakfast. But for the women across the tables, it was treasure. Every slice of bread became a canvas for the golden spread, and every bite became a communion with the past. Some of the women whispered to each other about home. One spoke of a farm in Bavaria, where her family had once churned butter by hand, the rhythm of the wooden dasher echoing in the barn. Another remembered her grandmother's kitchen in Saxony, where butter had been melted over potatoes and cabbage before the war. Another recalled Christmas mornings, when buttered bread had been paired with jam, a treat now so distant it felt like a fairy tale. They shared these stories in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile dream laid out before them. And then there were those who could not speak at all. They ate in silence, their eyes glistening, their hands trembling as they held each slice carefully, almost reverently. Butter was not just food. It was memory, comfort, and proof of life before everything had collapsed. For some, it was too much to bear. Tears slipped down cheeks, mixing with the salt of bread and butter on their lips. No one mocked them, no one judged. In that mess hall, every woman knew exactly what the others felt. The moment stretched on, timeless, as though the world outside the camp had stopped. The war, the destruction, the grief, it all seemed to fade for the length of a meal. The butter was more than nourishment. It was healing. It was a reminder that they were still alive, still capable of tasting joy, still capable of remembering what it meant to be human. For hours afterward, the women spoke of little else. They replayed the taste in their minds, the texture on their tongues, the simple act of spreading butter across bread. Some feared it was a one-time indulgence, a fleeting miracle never to be repeated. Others dared to hope that it was the beginning of something more, a pattern of kindness, a promise that life in captivity would not strip them of all comfort. Whatever the truth, none of them could forget the way that morning felt. Long after the plates were cleared, the memory lingered. Women lay awake that night, recalling the golden sheen of butter in the sunlight, the way it melted into warm bread, the way it filled their mouths with a taste that felt like home. In the midst of captivity, in the shadow of war, they had been given not just food but hope. And in their hearts, they knew that even years later, they would remember the moment their captors placed butter before them, and the disbelief that turned into quiet, tearful gratitude. The bread and butter were more than food. That much became clear to the women almost immediately. At first, they had devoured them with trembling hands and hungry mouths, their senses overwhelmed by taste and memory. But as the first shock faded, something deeper began to take shape. Each slice of bread, each dab of butter, was not simply nourishment, it was a message, silent yet undeniable. It told them that captivity here would not be the degradation they had braced for. It told them that, in this place, their captors were not interested in stripping away every shred of their humanity. It told them that they were not being held as beasts, but as human beings, still worthy of dignity. The women had spent years under the shadow of propaganda. They had been told, again and again, that the Americans were brutes, merciless conquerors who despised Germans with unrelenting hatred. Some had believed it, others had doubted, but fear had filled the spaces between doubt and belief. They entered captivity expecting vengeance. They expected the victors to remind them, every hour of every day, of their defeat. They expected punishment, mockery, and perhaps even starvation as a form of revenge. And yet, when they bit into bread so soft it seemed to dissolve on the tongue, when they spread butter so golden it glowed in the morning light, those assumptions faltered. It was as if the camp itself had spoken. You are prisoners, yes, but you will not be stripped of your humanity here. For many of the women, this realization struck harder than the taste itself. They had grown accustomed to a world where survival meant surrendering small pieces of dignity day by day. In Germany, the final years of the war had reduced proud families to scavengers, desperate mothers to beggars, and soldiers' wives to shadows of their former selves. Bread was stretched with fillers, soup with water, hope with lies. Now inside the fences of an enemy camp, they were being offered food, not as punishment, but as something close to respect. The irony was overwhelming, but so was the relief. They began to see the bread and butter as symbols, not symbols carved in stone or proclaimed in speeches, but quiet, humble tokens of a different reality. A loaf could mean survival, yes, but here it meant more. It meant they would not be treated as less than human. Butter was not only richness on the tongue. It was proof that someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had chosen to treat them with a measure of kindness. Each act of eating became an act of recognition. You matter. You still matter, even as a prisoner. The silence in the mess hall gave way to cautious voices. Women spoke in hushed tones, exchanging thoughts they had been afraid to voice before. One said, "If they meant to starve us, this would never be here." Another whispered, "They could give us nothing but gruel, but they gave us bread like this." A third muttered, her voice thick with emotion, "If this is the beginning, perhaps we will endure." These words were small, fragile, yet they carried the weight of new belief. Fear, which had pressed so heavily on their shoulders, loosened just enough for them to breathe. The bread and butter became more than food. They became a kind of ritual. To break bread in that camp was to acknowledge a shift in their reality. It was to let go, even if only slightly, of the nightmare they had been bracing for. And with every bite, they felt a strange, unspoken connection forming between them. They were no longer just individuals surviving in isolation. They were women who shared in the same astonishment, the same disbelief, the same fragile hope. The bread united them, gave them a common anchor in the storm. For the guards and officers who brought the food, it might have been nothing. For them, bread and butter were simply part of daily rations, not a symbol, not a statement. But for the women, every slice carried meaning. It was impossible to ignore the contrast between the barbed wire fences and the golden crusts of bread, between the towers and the butter melting over warm slices. One was the symbol of imprisonment. The other, astonishingly, had become the symbol of dignity. The two existed side by side, clashing and colliding, forcing the prisoners to reconcile what they saw with what they felt. This was not freedom, they reminded themselves. They were still prisoners, still cut off from families and homes, still surrounded by fences and watchtowers. But the bread and butter meant something undeniable. Captivity did not have to strip them of their spirit. And that realization was powerful. Some women found themselves smiling for the first time in weeks, their faces softening as they chewed. Others sat straighter at the tables, as if the food itself had given them back a fragment of pride. Even those who wept did so with a strange strength, as if the tears carried away a portion of the fear that had settled into their bones. In that hall, dignity returned, not in grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but in the simplest of human acts, eating bread, spreading butter, and realizing they were still seen as human beings. When the meal ended, the women walked back to their quarters more quietly than usual. But within their silence, something had changed. The bread and butter were not just memories of taste. They were reminders of a truth too powerful to ignore. Humanity still existed, even here, even in captivity, even between enemies. And for women who had braced themselves for cruelty, that truth was more nourishing than the food itself. The memory of that morning lingered long after the bread was eaten and the butter gone. For the German women prisoners, it became something more than a simple meal. It became a point in time where everything shifted. In the chaos of war and the fear of captivity, there had been little room for hope. But now, with the taste of fresh bread and butter still vivid on their tongues, they found themselves holding on to something they had not expected to feel in an American camp: the beginnings of trust. They had entered with terror in their hearts, bracing for punishment and humiliation, and instead they found themselves cared for in ways that defied all they had imagined. It was not freedom, but it was something they could never forget. Days turned into weeks, and the women spoke often of that first meal. It was repeated, of course. Bread and butter returned again and again to their tables, but the first time carried a weight no repetition could replace. That moment had been the turning point, the instant when the iron grip of fear loosened enough to let something else in. Even when food became routine, that first astonishment remained etched in their minds. In whispered conversations at night, while lying on their bunks beneath the watchful glow of floodlights, they recalled the golden loaves, the rich butter, the way their hands had trembled as they spread it across warm slices. They spoke of the way tears had come unbidden, of how the simplest act of eating had cracked open their hardened hearts. Years of deprivation had dulled their ability to dream, but the bread and butter restored something fragile inside them. It was not just nourishment for their bodies, it was nourishment for their spirits. Many women would later say it was the first time they realized they might survive captivity not only with their health, but with their sense of self intact. The taste carried them through the monotony of camp life, through the long hours of labor, through the ache of separation from home. It reminded them that there could still be kindness in the world, even between those who had once called each other enemies. There were moments when despair still tried to reclaim them. The fences remained, the guards still paced the watchtowers, and freedom was as far away as ever. But even in the hardest hours, the memory of that bread and butter was a thread they could hold on to. It was proof that they were not forgotten, not reduced to faceless prisoners. It was a reminder that humanity could emerge even in unlikely places. That taste lived inside them, and it made the burden of captivity lighter. Some women later admitted that they had carried that memory for the rest of their lives. Long after the war ended, long after they returned home to a Germany broken and scarred, the memory of that camp meal lingered like a photograph in the mind. They would sit at family tables once more, years later, and as bread was passed around, they would remember. They would remember the fear, the hunger, the disbelief, and then the miracle of food given freely. They would tell their children and grandchildren about that morning, about how, even in the heart of war, in the hands of an enemy, kindness had taken them by surprise. Others never spoke of it aloud, but carried it silently, a private memory locked away. For them, it was too personal, too intimate to put into words. But even in silence, the memory worked its quiet magic. It became a piece of their identity, a marker of survival, a symbol that hope could endure in the most unexpected of places. The bread and butter were never just food. They became a lesson, one that echoed long after the camps were emptied. They proved that compassion could cross the boundaries of nation and uniform, that even enemies could recognize one another's humanity. In a world torn apart by war, that truth was powerful. It was a truth that softened hearts, that made reconciliation possible in the years after the fighting ended. For the women themselves, it was more personal. It was the moment fear began to fade, the moment survival became more than endurance, the moment their captors became more complex than the caricatures painted by propaganda. In the warmth of bread and the richness of butter, they saw not cruelty, but humanity. And it was humanity they remembered long after the fences had fallen. The image of that bread, that butter, that quiet hall filled with women in disbelief never left them. Some would later say it was the first time they understood what it meant to be truly human again, after years of war had stripped so much away. It was the simplest of gifts, yet it carried a weight no treasure could match. The bread and butter became part of their story, part of the legacy of survival, part of the testimony that even in war, kindness could prevail. And as the years passed, that memory did not fade. It became sharper, brighter, as if age itself polished it like a jewel. They remembered the sunlight falling across the tables, the steam rising from broken loaves, the golden sheen of butter melting into soft bread. They remembered the tears, the laughter, the disbelief, and they remembered the feeling that, for one fleeting moment, they were not prisoners at all, but human beings sharing in the miracle of food, the miracle of compassion. The story of those German women prisoners is not one of luxury, nor of freedom, nor of joy. It is a story of survival, and within that survival, the glimmers of humanity that made endurance possible. The bread and butter were not just sustenance, they were hope. They were memory. They were proof that even behind fences, even in the heart of captivity, the human spirit could be fed and kept alive.